The crisis in the liberal international order, insights from history theory and current events. This is part two. In part one, we talked about the 80 or so years since the creation of the post World War II liberal international order, the liberal rules based system, the liberal global system, different names for it. So let's now juxtapose that against a very different view of international relations. If the post war era, the post war liberal order, essentially underwritten and guaranteed by the United States, uh, which we call liberalism, some call it idealism, was premised on the idea of mutual cooperation, that cooperation is good for everyone, including the hegemon. Uh, there's a much starker and a much older, much more ancient view of international relations, which one might call the realist view. And this has now come to the fore with many who seem to believe that the liberal order is running its course, as we talked about in part one. And a lot of writers have been invoking this very famous quotation from Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War, the great Greek historian Thucydides. And this was written circa 416 BCE during the ongoing war between Athens and Sparta, or rather, I should say that this particular quote that is now often cited, that's the context in which it occurs. It's sometimes called the Melian dialogue. That's Melian, and it recalls a time when Athens and Sparta were at war. That was the essence of the Peloponnesian War. And Melos was a small Aegean island, originally a colony of Sparta, but had been for a long time independent and neutral in this war between Athens and Sparta. And Athens demanded tribute and allegiance from the island, from the people of Melos, but they refused. They said, "We are neutral. We are not parties to this war, and we don't wish to take sides, nor do we wish to pay you the tribute that you demand." And Athens, then at the height of the zenith of its imperial power, saw this claimed neutrality by Melos, this pesky island just off the coast, and that might resonate for different reasons today, as a potential weakness in its sphere of influence, its sphere of control. The worry was that the example of Melos might lead others in the Athenian-led coalition to defect to Sparta, or perhaps to try to become neutral and just drop out. So Athens felt it had to make an example of Melos. And before anything could be done by anyone else, Athens sent a large expeditionary force, dozens of ships and thousands of troops. Again, resonates with what's in the news today, doesn't it? To demand submission by the people, by the government of Melos, to accept vassal status of Athens. And the Athenians, before they eventually attacked Melos, sent emissaries, envoys, to negotiate. That's what it was called, but really it was to provide an ultimatum to the Melian leaders. And Thucydides dramatizes this exchange as a dialogue where the Athenians dismiss the Meletians' appeals to justice, to fairness, their appeal to the gods, their wish that Sparta might somehow come and rescue them. And and the Athenians in response said, well, such considerations really only count between equals in power. And this is the famous quote that I want to read you. This is the standard or a standard English translation of the classical Greek. And this is the Athenians speaking to the Melians. Right as the world goes, let me start again, right as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, whilst the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And that is a very pithy and powerful statement of the realist view of international relations. The idea that we can talk about fairness and justice and all of these things, but as, for example, as Stephen Miller, an important advisor to President Trump at present, said, well, these are all really just words, these are concepts, but in the end it comes down to power. That's a very blunt statement of a realist view of the world, that rules and trade and justice and fairness and rule of law, all of that is great rhetoric, but in the end it comes down to who is the most powerful, and that's both economic power and military power, and this realist view leads us to a view of the world as an unending conflict between great powers, maybe punctuated by periods of armistice, but not really peace. And so a provocative thesis, it might have been provocative a couple of years ago, some of us have been talking about it, but could be that this liberal order, this liberal world we lived through for 80 years, really was an anomaly. It was a blip. It was an interregnum in a world characterized by great power conflict, and has been so characterized by centuries or millennia or indeed much of human history. Now, as a little bit of historical context, if you go back to the 19th century after the defeat of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, 1814, there was a period, at least in Europe, and that's the asterisk here, it's not the whole world, but at least among the major powers of Europe, there was no major conflict, no major war from 1814 up until 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. So you had 50 or 60 years of a type of rules-based system where the great powers cooperated in some ways, or at least didn't interfere with each other, and in which there was no major warfare. And that was that itself was anomalous in world history, but even more anomalous, even more of possibly an interregnum or possibly an aberration or a fluke, was this 80-year period in which somehow the elements came together. You had a super powerful hegemon with, at that time, a wise and forward-looking leadership that realized that cooperation could be good for everyone, and that we, the hegemon, we the US, would also benefit and let others benefit. We can all benefit through mutual cooperation. And don't forget, there was great power conflict, even in that we shouldn't look at this with rose-colored spectacles. Great power conflict with the Soviet Union, with Soviet Russia, and then of course with China during this period. But at least for much of the Western world, and then increasingly parts of what we now call the South, it was a time of cooperation, of trade, and of mutual gain, with no major wars, at least among great powers or major powers. So we can ask the question, was that just a fluke, an accident of history, that the ingredients came together, but that's not how it's meant to be or how it has been historically, that eventually that realist impulse that might makes right will take over, particularly if a hegemon feels that it's overstretched, either economically or militarily. It might say, well, look, it's time to go back to first principles, go back to basics. We've got to assert our economic and military primacy in the world. And if the United States thinks that way, if China thinks that way, Russia, not exactly a great power, but still has its sphere of influence, uh, then it could be that this 80-year period that we've lived through was just that, an interregnum, a blip, and we're moving back towards a world of great power conflict as the norm, and periods of peace and mutual cooperation of a liberal rules-based system as the exception. That's a provocative. Perhaps some of you take that as given, but for many of us who grew up in that liberal world, for those of us who lived through, for example, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe, uh, uh, and of course there was a sense of euphoria at that time. Francis Fukuyama's famous "The End of History," that we're all on the liberal democratic capitalist page now. And that was obviously turned out not to be correct. But so certainly those of us of my generation and older who even recall the Second World War and the aftermath, perhaps got used to this world. And we've got to start asking, is this now the end of the road? And are we getting back into a world that would have been familiar to the Athenians and the Spartans, a world of great power conflict? And there's a thought to ponder for my students, anyone else who might be watching this. And I'm going to go on now to a third part where we talk a bit about someone who has a lot of interesting things to say, not specifically on this liberalism versus realism question, but on questions that are very closely related. So stay tuned for part 3.